I'm going to read from the book of Ezra. Please don't turn to it. Pretend this is a podcast. Ezra chapter 10. What I'm going to read you takes place about a century after the Jews came home, a very few number of them, from exile. And by now we're talking to the great-grandchildren and the great-great-grandchildren of those who came back. Ezra and Nehemiah come back at about the same time, and they discover things are not in good shape in Jerusalem. The walls are not built yet, and there's some horrible disobedience to God's word. Chapter 10, listen to the disobedience and the solution. Now, while Ezra was praying, and while he was confessing, weeping, and bowing down before the house of God, a very large assembly of men, women, and children gathered to him from Israel, for the people wept very bitterly. And Shechaniah, the son of Jehiel, one of the sons of Elam, spoke up and said to Ezra, "We have trespassed against our God, and have taken pagan wives from the peoples of the land. Yet now there is hope in Israel in spite of this. Now therefore let us make a covenant with our God to put away all these wives and those who have been born to them, according to the advice of my master and of those who tremble at the commandment of our God, and let it be done according to the law." And then jumping down to verse 9. So all the men of Judah and Benjamin gathered at Jerusalem within 3 days. It was the 9th month, on the 20th of the month, and all the people sat in the open square of the house of God, trembling because of this matter and because of heavy rain. Then Ezra the priest stood up and said to them, "You have transgressed and have taken pagan wives according to the guilt of Israel. Now therefore, make confession to the Lord God of your fathers and do his will. Separate yourselves from the peoples of the land and from the pagan wives." Then all the assembly answered and said with a loud voice, "Yes, as you have said, so we must do." And now I'm going to turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And before I read, a little context here. Corinth was a large commercial city, notorious for its culture. A new church where Paul had stayed for, maybe 18 months as he preached and founded that church. And then Paul was over across the Aegean Sea at Ephesus, and he got two things from Corinth. He got a letter from Corinth with a number of questions. He also got word from Chloe's family. Now, whether Chloe's family was from Ephesus and had made a trip to Corinth for business reasons probably, and came back and said, "You should know what's going on in Corinth," or whether Chloe's family is actually in the church at Corinth and sent further word back to Paul, "You should know what's going on." So 1 Corinthians has 6 chapters in which Paul deals with all those things in Corinth that the church did not want to send to Paul and say, "What should we do about this?" Such as they were arguing fiercely, a man was sleeping with his stepmother, etc. Churches like to keep their own dirty laundry to themselves if they can. And then in chapter 7, he takes up questions that they had actually asked him in a letter. So that's where we are in chapter 7. We're now over the really unpleasant stuff for the church to questions that they were asking, some practical, some theological. And we come to chapter 7, and I'm going to read from verse 10. "Now to the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. A wife is not to depart from her husband. But even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. and the husband is not to divorce his wife. But to the rest, I, not the Lord, say, if any brother has a wife who does not believe, and she is willing to live with him, let him not divorce her. And the woman who has a husband who does not believe, if he is willing to live with her, let her not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but now they are holy. But if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases. But God has called us to peace. For how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? How many of you have unbelieving relatives? Please raise your hands. Okay, pretty good collection. What counts as relatives? Well, let's go from the inside out. Who is your closest relative? If you're married, it's your husband or your wife. Then it is your children and parents. Then it is brothers and sisters. Then it is uncles and aunts and cousins and grandparents and in-laws. Most of us can actually draw a fairly large family connection tree once we get out to the cousins and the in-laws and so on. My wife and I talk about our 10 children. 5 biological, 5 son-in-law, daughter-in-law, and so on. And we talk about them a lot. Which is the most difficult if you have one of them an unbeliever? Well, answer is husband or wife. You are married until death do you part. You live together in the same house day after day. The children grow and they leave and you stay. You have to deal with finances. And there is nothing closer than a husband and wife. So, the question came from the church in Corinth. What should a believing husband do where an unbelieving wife is present? What should a believing wife do where she has an unbelieving husband? Here's what Paul writes in answer to the question. He says, I write to you married people. And this isn't from me, this is from the Lord. You're not to divorce. A wife is not to depart from her husband. Yet not I, but the Lord says, you were not to depart from your husband. Any wife, at least some point in her marriage, can think of a good reason to leave her husband. Except for those of you married to perfect men. I won't ask for hands. And at any time in marriage, a husband can come up with a good reason to leave his wife, except for those like me who have perfect wives. I watched and heard that little snicker there. And you can go to the Gospels and find where Jesus taught exactly this. There's one passage in Matthew, not continued as a parallel in Mark and Luke, where you have the same teaching, where he says, except for the case of, and then it's actually somewhat ambiguous, but church teaching has said, adultery. Otherwise, you stay married. And adultery doesn't mean you have to get married. It just means, in that case, justified. If you choose. Now, what about people who have separated? Can't get along, or somehow you just don't want to be with this person. What are your options if you separate? Here's what he writes. If she does depart, she's got 2 choices. Remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband and go back. That's it. She can remain unmarried or go back to her husband and be reconciled. And then emphasizing again, a husband is not to divorce his wife. Roman law was quite lax where divorce was concerned. It was pretty easy for a husband to get rid of his wife. It was pretty easy actually for a wife to divorce her husband. That was Roman law. Islamic law is as easy as it could be if you're a man. All a man has to do to divorce his wife is to look at her and say, I divorce you 3 times in a row. I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you. No need to give a reason. Just you do that. The Jewish rabbis had a great deal of argument as to when it was justifiable to put away your wife. And you had one school that said basically never, and the other school that said if she burns the toast. If she displeases you in any way, then you may put her away. And there was a somewhat to us obscure little passage in the law that they argued about. Then comes something that is rather startling to us as we read it. Verse 12. But to the rest, I, not the Lord, say. Now, what in the world can Paul mean when he says, I, not the Lord, say? It's easy to forget that the preachers of the gospel, the apostles, as they went around preaching, what did they preach? Well, essentially they preached what's in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So that when Paul leaves Corinth, they've gotten the content of Matthew, Mark, Luke, right? So they know what Jesus has taught. Soon written down, actually maybe already written down. We have no idea when the Gospels were actually written. And anybody reading Paul's letter would say, yes, but what about the situation where you have an unbelieving husband or an unbelieving wife? You see, the first is already to believers. Now, Jesus never addressed that issue, and I'll tell you why. He was always talking to Jews. And in Israel, outwardly at least, every Jew is part of the people of God. And so although obviously there's a difference between being circumcised in the flesh and circumcised in the heart, as Deuteronomy says, the assumption and the outward reality is, the outward appearance is, everybody is really part of the people of God. So you don't have the reason to say, what about this unbeliever? It's not like Ezra, you see. Ezra faced a situation where the people of God had been marrying completely pagan wives. Was this allowed by the law? Absolutely not. It's a constant problem in Israel's history for a long way back. Well, what do you do if you've made that decision to disregard God's law and marry an unbeliever? Well, Ezra, as we just read, he gathers all the people together and they hear the law and they say, we have sinned, we have to put away our pagan wives. Now, what's the meaning of put away? Divorce. And not only the wives, did you catch who else you get rid of? The children. So you're to send the wife and the children away. Now, where do they go? Back to their father's house in that society. So they show up, you can see the woman shows up with 1, 2, 3, 5 children in tow at her father's house and says, my husband has sent me home to you. And that's what happened. Paul addresses it. Does his word have authority? Well, yes, it does. Paul was an apostle. He spoke with the Spirit of God, as he says in another place, do not I also have the Spirit? So although this is not part of Jesus' teaching, and you can't find it in the 4 Gospels, it is part of the Bible's teaching, and is part of apostolic teaching, and he's dealing with a situation that has arisen in Corinth and every other church that he went to, in which you would preach and some Gentiles would believe, but not their husbands or wives. And some Jews would believe, but not their husbands or wives. And now you would go, do you remember how when Paul would preach somewhere, the synagogues would be the people would be at each other's throats. And not only that, you have the same thing with the pagans. So where the gospel went, it came like a knife slicing through butter, leaving on one side believers, on the other side unbelievers, and then the churches had to deal with, and the individual believers had to deal with in some cases, believing Jewish man and wife who says, no way. Or believing Jewish wife who's now become a follower of Jesus and follows the way of the Lord, and husband says no way. And you got the same thing if you have a pagan husband or a pagan wife. I've tried to imagine if you were in the church in Corinth and you'd sent off this question to Paul, and now comes back the letter, and first he spent 6 chapters dealing with all the problems in Corinth you didn't want him to know about. And now he gets to the questions you sent him, and you want to hear, what shall I do if I am married now to a pagan or to a Jew who has rejected Jesus? And I suspect that some of the people in Corinth were hoping he would say, put them away, divorce them. And others might be hoping to hear just the opposite. So, some probably happy to hear this read, some disappointed, probably all of them just a little bit perplexed. It's not what was done in Ezra's day, was it? And it's not anything that Jesus himself directly taught. So now this is a new question, new situation, and now the answer. And again, I can imagine some eager to get rid of their husbands and wives, and others dreading getting rid of their husbands or wives. Either way, you're going to have some people in the church not happy with the answer. But let's go to the perplexed. What has changed so that now you don't put away the unbelieving wife or husband? Well, let me go to something that we read past in the Gospels, and we probably don't quite get the reaction of the day. In Mark chapter 1, just to pick an example, and there are others like this, Jesus is, after preaching in the synagogue and healing a lot of people, he goes on a tour of the villages, and a man who's a leper comes up to him, and Jesus does something that would cause every Jew to go, ah! Do you remember what Jesus did? He touched him. Now, according to the law, what would happen when you touched a leper? You are unclean. And so, again, for the Jews, the first time they would see this or hear about this about Jesus, Jesus touched a leper. He did it on purpose. It wasn't accidental. He touched a leper. Why would he do that? Well, notice what happened. The leper became clean. That's the difference that comes with Jesus. Instead of you touch what's unclean and you become unclean, now where Jesus goes and touches, it becomes clean. Does the same follow for his followers? Actually, yes. What did Jesus say you are? Not you should be, you are. You are the salt of the earth. What does he say? You are the light of the world. It doesn't say you should be. It doesn't say try to be. It is you are. And Christians, wherever they are, unless they are under deep disguise, the unbelievers around them sniff you out pretty quickly. They really do. Because a different spirit is in you than in them. And where you have a group of a large number of Christians and only a few unbelievers, guess what the unbelievers start acting like? Well, they start acting like the believers. That doesn't mean they're believers, but they sort of act like it. And from the blessing of God to his people, a blessing spreads then further. Where the disciples of Christ are, the world is cleansed and things change. Now we're going to notice later on, he doesn't say your wife is automatically saved. That's a different issue. I preached last week down in Delmarva, first chapter of Mark, and I pointed out that when the man in the synagogue suddenly had an evil spirit speak through him and just totally disrupt the service, nobody was surprised. When were they surprised? Amazed, astonished. This is when Jesus said to the unclean spirit, come out of him. And he did. That was the surprising thing. Now, why weren't they surprised the first time? Well, because they were used to having people who were demonically possessed. You've never seen that. Neither have I. Why not? We live where the gospel of Jesus Christ is gone, and where that goes, the demons have to retreat. Where the gospel of Jesus Christ goes, sacrifice ends. One generation, two generation, and it ends, and not to start again. Even with all the power of the state and all the money of the government, the Roman Emperor Julian, in around 360, could not get the temples up and going again. He had some intellectual support, some people saying this is the old way, we need to go back to this as Romans, and you had loads of money poured into the temples. The pagan temples are repaired, and the empire by now is by no means all Christian, not even majority Christian. But the pagan sacrifices, nobody has any faith in them anymore at all. Because when the real sacrifice came, when the reality came, then the shadow that anticipated it is done away with. Now, there's a challenge in maintaining a marriage like this, isn't there? Who's going to teach the children? And what are they going to teach them? What do you do when the husband says, we're going to the temple, it's the time for the annual sacrifice? And the wife says, I don't go to pagan temples and sacrifices anymore. You have a lot more reasons for argument and discussion. It is not easy to be married to an unbeliever. How about eating meals? You know, eating meals became a problem. If you say, I'd like to have my church friends over. Well, if it's a Jewish husband or wife, you don't eat with Gentiles. Paul goes on to say, for the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Otherwise, your children will be unclean, but now they are holy. What's it mean that the children are holy? Well, you notice the Christian church, as far back as you can find, has always baptized the children of believers when only one believes. If the wife or the mother believes and the husband doesn't, the church will baptize the children. Likewise, if the husband believes but the wife does not, the church will baptize the children. Why? Because the children now, by rights, belong to God. They are set apart for Him. They are holy. And the basic meaning of holy is set apart for God. That doesn't mean they'll submit, but by rights, they belong to Him. So the children are baptized, they are holy, and that's the practice of the church. Are they saved? No. But verse 16, how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? You see, you have special hope. Your husband or wife is now living very close to a child of God. It's going to be harder and harder to resist the pricks. You remember Jesus says to Paul, it's a reference to how you would keep an ox in line. You'd have a stick and you just poke him in the side. It's hard to kick against the pricks because Paul had his conscience hitting him and hitting him and hitting him and hitting him. Well, husband married to a believing wife has the same thing, and the other way around also. Is it easy to be married now, once you are saved, to someone not saved? Oh my, no. But whoever said being a Christian was easy? Actually, Jesus said, count on it, it's going to be hard. If any man wants to follow me, let him take up his cross daily and come after me. And in his day, there's a literal meaning to it. In our day, there is a literal meaning to it. Christians didn't stop dying for their faith in the first century or the second century or the 20th century or the 21st century. I just finished working on a book of history from this country, from our church, 1920 to 1980. And I came across a little note, 1951. A missionary to China by the name of Sam Boyle writes, I just received word that elder, and I forget the guy's name right now, was executed by the communists. I laid my hands on him 3 years ago. And I said to him as I laid my hands on him, are you ready to die for the name of Christ? Today, he has fulfilled his promise. Well, if that's what Jesus demands of his followers, husband, you can stand putting up with your unbelieving wife. And wife, you can stand putting up with your unbelieving husband. Does this mean go ahead and marry somebody unbelievers? Oh my, no, absolutely not. The Bible's totally against doing this. But what happens when you're both unbelievers and then one believes? What does Peter say to the wife in this situation? Be the best possible wife you can and mostly keep your mouth shut. I read it to you from 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. Wives, likewise, be submissive to your own husbands, that even if some do not obey the word, they, without a word, may be won by the conduct of their wives, when they observe your chaste conduct accompanied by fear. In other words, wife, don't leave Bible tracts all around strategically. Don't keep bringing it up. Just be as good a wife as you can be. Now, what about other relatives? Well, I've taken the hard case, and it's the hard case that the Bible directly addresses. Other relatives. Well, suppose you have got children and your husband is not a believer. Well, then you would be like, well, there are two women, mother and grandmother, who raised a fellow named Timothy. And they went ahead and taught Timothy. Timothy believed the prophets, and when Paul came through, he believed. And then he became one of Paul's right-hand men. Grown children are not usually in the same house with you. That makes it somewhat easier. How about a repentant adult? Do you take him back? Well, I like the story of the prodigal son. It's not directly instructive, and it has a different meaning, but that sort of suggests, yes, you take him back if he's repentant. How about including him in the estate when you die? So when it comes time to write your will, and you know, what am I going to do with the $3,500,000 that I've got? Actually, you're free to do whatever you want with it. You're free to leave it to none of your children. You can leave it all to Geneva College. I have somebody I can put you in touch with who will be very glad to have you leave it all to Geneva College. So you are not obligated in any way with the money. Do you take care of your unbelieving parents if they need it? Yes. The command is honor your father and mother, and it doesn't add if they are worthy. It just says honor your father and mother. How about other unbelieving relatives? Well, Jesus says treat them like Gentiles. Now that's in a Jewish context. So you treat them like Gentiles. You can find that in Matthew chapter 18. A person excommunicated from the church because he won't listen to the church at all, and now you treat him like a Gentile. Okay, but what's it mean to treat somebody like a Gentile? Well, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, even the Gentiles say hello to each other. Even the Gentiles can be generous with their children. So, how do you treat the Gentiles? You smile. You're generous. And so the same with unbelieving relatives. You love them, you greet them as they do each other. What about the verses in the Bible about shunning unbelievers? That is for a very narrow set of people. You can find it in 1 Corinthians 5, 2 Thessalonians 3, 2 John verse 10. If somebody pretends to be a follower of Jesus, but his life is openly scandalous, don't treat him as though he is a follower of Jesus. If somebody claims to be a follower of Jesus, but his life is openly scandalous, then don't treat him like a believer. That's where you need to draw an open line so the whole world knows, no, we're not on the same team right now. And lastly, for lost relatives, you grieve and pray. There should be no, oh well, reaction. Or, I guess he's not one of God's elect reaction. Grief, as Paul had for Israel, he writes about it in Romans chapter 9. Grief and prayer for the unbelieving relatives. And in fact, Paul instructs Timothy, we're to pray for all men. We're to pray for kings and all in authority, and we're to pray to all men. We're to give thanks for all men. That's just kind of a startling thing. We're to give thanks for all men and pray for all those in authority. Husband or wife, stay with your unbelieving husband or wife if they are willing to have you. If they don't want you around, let the marriage end. We're supposed to have peace and not war. But if they're willing, live with them. And your faith claims them for God, so they're made holy. It's not my invention, this is Paul's. They are made holy by your belief. And your children also. And children at home, teach them, love them, greet everyone, and deal generously with all whom you come in contact with, including all your unbelieving relatives. Unbelieving relatives, what do you do with them? You love them as well as you can.